It's 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 2024, and the sun is barely cresting over the Oklahoma plains when three unmarked police vehicles roll slowly down Maple Street in Goltry, a town so small you could walk from one end to the other in 15 minutes. Neighbors peek through their curtains. Mrs. Patterson, already up making coffee, watches as officers in tactical vests step out and approach a modest ranch-style house with faded blue shutters. She recognizes that house. Everyone in Goltry does. The front door opens, and the man they place in handcuffs is someone this town has known for decades. Someone who's attended church potlucks, waved at kids walking to school, pumped gas at the corner station. Someone who's been here living his life while an entire community spent 38 years wondering what happened to Beatrice Rowan, the librarian who vanished without a trace in October 1986. The woman whose car sat abandoned in the library parking lot with her keys still inside. The daughter, the sister, the beloved community member whose scattered belongings were found in the woods, but whose body was never recovered. For nearly 4 decades, Goltry, Oklahoma carried the weight of that mystery. Families locked their doors a little tighter. Parents held their children a little closer. And every October, when the leaves started to turn, people whispered her name and wondered if they'd ever know the truth. But in 2024, advanced DNA technology and the relentless determination of investigators finally cracked this case wide open. And what they discovered didn't just solve a mystery, it shattered everything this town thought they knew about that October night in 1986. Before we reveal exactly who was arrested, how investigators connected decades-old evidence to a person who'd been hiding in plain sight, and the stunning details that came to light during the interrogation, hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Because what you're about to hear is one of the most unbelievable cold case breakthroughs I've ever covered. This is the complete story of Beatrice Rowan's disappearance, the limitations that stopped justice in the 1980s, the families who refused to give up, and the March morning that finally brought answers after 38 years of silence. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back to where it all began. Goltry, Oklahoma in 1986 wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. With a population hovering just under 300, this farming community in northern Oklahoma was the definition of small-town America. Main Street consisted of a post office, a grain elevator, a diner called Rosie's where everyone knew your usual order, and the Goltry Public Library, a modest brick building that had served the community since 1952. The kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where Friday night football games brought out nearly every resident, and Sunday morning church services did the same. The kind of place where your neighbor wasn't just someone who lived next door. They were family. And at the heart of that community was Beatrice Rowan. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments. I love seeing where this story reaches. Beatrice was 32 years old in the fall of 1986, though everyone said she had one of those faces that could have been anywhere from 25 to 40. She'd been the head librarian at Goltry Public Library for 7 years, taking over the position after old Mrs. Henderson retired. If you'd grown up in Goltry during the 1980s, you knew Beatrice. She was the woman who'd help you find the perfect book for your book report, even if it meant calling libraries in neighboring towns to track it down. She organized the summer reading program every year, complete with homemade certificates and small prizes she often paid for out of her own pocket. She knew every kid by name, remembered what books they liked, and had an uncanny ability to recommend exactly what they needed, even if they didn't know it themselves. She just had this way about her, one former patron recalled years later, like she genuinely cared about every single person who walked through those doors. Beatrice had grown up in Enid, about 30 miles south, but moved to Goltry after graduating from the University of Central Oklahoma with a degree in library science. She'd taken an apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, a cozy one-bedroom with plants in every window and shelves overflowing with books. Her younger sister, Margaret, still lived in Enid with their parents, and Beatrice would drive down most Sundays for family dinner. She wasn't married, though she'd dated a few men over the years. Nothing serious had ever materialized. but those who knew her said she seemed content with her life. She had her books, her community work, her Friday night bowling league, and her close circle of friends. At the library, she'd arrive every morning around 8:30 a.m., a full 30 minutes before opening, carrying a thermos of coffee and usually a brown paper bag with her lunch inside. She'd unlock the heavy wooden doors, flip on the lights, and begin her daily routine, checking returned books back into the system using the card catalog method. This was years before computers would modernize small-town libraries, shelving books in their proper places, and preparing for whatever the day might bring. The library wasn't just a place to borrow books in Goltry. It was a community hub. Elderly residents came in to read newspapers and chat. Teenagers did homework at the long tables near the windows. Young mothers brought toddlers for story time on Wednesday mornings, a program Beatrice had started herself, complete with hand puppets and animated voices that made the kids squeal with laughter. She did all the voices, one mother remembered. The big bad wolf, the 3 little pigs, all of them. The kids absolutely loved her. On October 14, 1986, Beatrice followed her usual routine. She wore a cream-colored cardigan over a floral print dress. Her sister would later describe it in detail to police, and her brown leather flats. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She'd waved to Ray Hutchins as he opened up the hardware store below her apartment that morning. She'd chatted briefly with the mailman around noon. She'd helped a group of high school students research their history papers in the afternoon. Nothing about that Tuesday seemed unusual. Nothing suggested it would be the last day anyone would see Beatrice Rowan alive. To everyone who encountered her that day, she seemed like herself. Warm, helpful, that gentle smile always ready. She'd reminded a young boy that his copy of Where the Red Fern Grows was due back on Friday. She'd ordered 3 new books from the county system. She'd written in her daily log, a habit she maintained religiously, noting that 17 patrons had visited the library that day. The last confirmed sighting of Beatrice was around 6:30 p.m. The library closed at 6 going on weeknights, and several people reported seeing her locking up, the lights inside going dark one by one. She'd waved to Deputy Frank Morrison as he drove past on his evening patrol. She'd called out a goodbye to Mr. Chen, the owner of the small grocery down the street, who was sweeping his front steps. And then she was gone. October 1986 would be the month that changed Goltry forever. The month that turned neighbors into suspects, transformed a safe haven into a place of fear and suspicion, and left a wound in this small community that wouldn't heal for nearly 4 decades. But on that Tuesday evening, as the sun set over the Oklahoma plains and Beatrice Rowan locked the library doors for the last time, no one could have imagined the nightmare that was about to unfold. Wednesday, October 15, 1986, started like any other morning in Goltry. Carol Jensen, the library assistant who worked with Beatrice 3 days a week, pulled into the library parking lot at 8:55 a.m., 5 minutes before opening. She expected to see Beatrice's car already there, a light blue 1982 Ford Escort with a small dent in the rear bumper from when she'd backed into a mailbox the previous summer. Beatrice was always early. The car was there, parked in its usual spot near the back entrance. But the library doors were still locked. The lights were off. And when Carol peered through the glass, she could see Tuesday's date still displayed on the desk calendar inside. She knocked, waited, knocked again, louder this time. Nothing. Carol walked around to Beatrice's car and looked inside. The driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition. Beatrice's brown leather purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet visible inside the open top. A library book, Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, rested on the dashboard. Carol's stomach dropped. She hurried to the payphone outside the post office and called the sheriff's department. Then she called Beatrice's apartment. The phone rang 8 times before she hung up. She called Beatrice's parents in Enid. Her mother, Dorothy, answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Rowan, this is Carol from the library. I'm sorry to bother you, but have you heard from Beatrice this morning?" There was a pause. "No, honey. Why? Is everything all right?" Carol chose her words carefully, trying not to alarm her. She's not at the library, but her car is here. I'm sure it's nothing, but I wanted to check if maybe she'd mentioned coming down to visit you." "She was supposed to call me last night," Dorothy said, her voice tightening. "We were planning Sunday dinner. She never called. I just thought she got busy." By 9:30 a.m., Sheriff Tom Bradford was standing in the library parking lot, examining Beatrice's escort. Carol, Dorothy Rowan, and a small crowd of concerned locals had gathered nearby. In a town this size, word traveled faster than wildfire. Sheriff Bradford was a 30-year veteran of law enforcement, but Goltry rarely saw anything more serious than bar fights or teenagers tipping cows. He opened the driver's door and carefully looked inside, trying not to disturb anything. Keys in the ignition, purse untouched, wallet inside with cash and credit cards, no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no broken glass. The interior was neat, exactly as you'd expect Beatrice to keep it. "When's the last time anyone saw her?" Bradford asked. Deputy Morrison stepped forward. "I saw her locking up the library around 6:30 last night. Waved at her as I drove past. She waved back, seemed perfectly normal." "Anyone see her after that?" Heads shook. Murmurs of no rippled through the crowd. Sheriff Bradford made a decision. "Frank, call the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Then I want every available person searching this town. Carol, I need you to tell me if anything looks off inside that library once we get it open." What they found inside the library only deepened the mystery. Everything was exactly as Beatrice would have left it. Books properly shelved, the card catalog organized. Her daily log filled out completely, the last entry noting the 6 p.m. closing time and her initials, BR, her coffee thermos, rinsed and sitting on the small counter in the back room. The cash register balanced, the day's minimal earnings logged in her precise handwriting. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. It was as if she'd simply locked up, walked outside, and vanished into thin air. By Wednesday afternoon, over 100 volunteers had joined the search. They combed Main Street, checked every alley, knocked on every door. They searched the grain elevator, the abandoned railway depot on the edge of town, the old Thornton farm that had sat empty for years. They called out her name until their voices went hoarse. Beatrice's sister Margaret arrived from Enid, her face pale with fear. "This isn't like her," she kept saying to anyone who would listen. Beatrice wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't leave her car. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. That night, the temperature dropped to 43 degrees. Volunteers brought flashlights and continued searching through the darkness. Dorothy Rowan sat in the sheriff's office, clutching a photograph of her daughter and praying. The diner stayed open past midnight, providing free coffee to searchers. Thursday morning brought no answers, just more questions and growing dread. Then, at approximately 2:15 p.m. on Thursday, October 16th, 2 volunteer searchers named Bill Tucker and his teenage son made a discovery that would haunt this town for decades. They'd been searching a wooded area about 3 miles northeast of town, past the old county road that hardly anyone used anymore. The trees were dense there, mostly oak and cottonwood, the ground covered in fallen leaves and underbrush. Bill almost walked right past it, but something caught his eye. A flash of cream-colored fabric snagged on a low branch. It was a cardigan. Beatrice's cream-colored cardigan, the one she'd been wearing Tuesday evening. It was torn, muddy, with leaves stuck to the fabric. One sleeve was nearly ripped off at the shoulder. "Don't touch anything," Bill shouted to his son. "Go get the sheriff, now." Within the hour, the wooded area was swarming with law enforcement. What they found painted a terrifying picture. Scattered across roughly 50 yards of forest floor, they discovered the torn cardigan, one brown leather flat, caked in mud, Beatrice's library ID badge, the laminated card cracked down the middle, a handful of loose change, her wristwatch, the band broken, but no Beatrice, no body, no additional evidence that explained what had happened in these woods. Sheriff Bradford stood in the center of the scene, his jaw clenched. Every item was carefully photographed, marked, and collected. They searched the surrounding area for hours, expanding the perimeter to half a mile in every direction. Cadaver dogs were brought in from Oklahoma City. Nothing. The discovery in the woods confirmed everyone's worst fears. Something terrible had happened to Beatrice Rowan. The torn clothing, the scattered belongings, the remote location. It all suggested violence, struggle, desperation. But without a body, without witnesses, without any clear evidence of exactly what had transpired, investigators were left grasping at shadows. By Friday, October 17th, the case had made regional news. Reporters from Enid and Oklahoma City descended on Goltry. Camera crews filmed the library, the parking lot, the forest where her belongings were found. Dorothy and Margaret Rowan appeared on the evening news, pleading for information, for Beatrice's safe return, for anything that might help bring their daughter and sister home. "If someone has her, please let her go," Dorothy said, tears streaming down her face. "If anyone knows anything, please come forward, please. She's my baby girl." The community held a candlelight vigil on Sunday evening. Nearly 300 people showed up, the entire town and then some. They sang hymns, shared memories of Beatrice, and prayed for a miracle. But deep down, as October gave way to November and the Oklahoma autumn turned cold, most people knew the truth they didn't want to face. Beatrice Rowan wasn't coming home. The question that would haunt Goltry for the next 38 years wasn't whether something terrible had happened to her. It was, who did this? And how did they get away with it? The Goltry Sheriff's Department had never handled a case like this. Sheriff Tom Bradford had spent 3 decades dealing with drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional theft. A missing person case, potentially a homicide, was far beyond the scope of what his small department was equipped to handle. Within 48 hours of Beatrice's disappearance, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation had taken over the case, bringing with them resources, manpower, and experience that Goltry simply didn't have. Lead investigator Detective Raymond Walsh arrived from Oklahoma City with a team of forensic specialists, evidence technicians, and additional agents. They set up a command center in the town hall, transforming the community meeting room into an investigation headquarters with maps, timelines, and evidence boards. But even with state resources, the case presented enormous challenges from the very beginning. The physical evidence was frustratingly limited. Beatrice's Ford Escort had been processed thoroughly, fingerprints lifted, fibers collected, every surface examined. The results were disappointing. The prints belonged to Beatrice, Carol Jensen, and a few library patrons who'd gotten rides from her in the past. Nothing suspicious, no unknown prints, no signs of forced entry or struggle inside the vehicle. The items recovered from the woods told a story of violence, but provided few concrete answers. The torn cardigan was sent to the state crime lab. Technicians found dirt, plant material, and what appeared to be small tears consistent with being dragged through underbrush. But in 1986, forensic technology had significant limitations. There was no DNA database, no way to extract and analyze genetic material from trace evidence, no national fingerprint registry that could be searched electronically. Everything was manual, painstaking, and often inconclusive. Detective Walsh focused on building a timeline and identifying potential suspects. In a town of less than 300 people, the pool of possibilities seemed manageable. But that assumption quickly proved naive. This case stumped investigators for decades. But stick with me, because the way they finally cracked it is absolutely mind-blowing. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss cases like this. The investigation began with the people closest to Beatrice. Her family was quickly cleared. Dorothy and her husband had been home in Enid that evening, confirmed by neighbors. Margaret had been at work in Oklahoma City, with dozens of witnesses. Friends and co-workers all had alibis that checked out. Then investigators moved to a wider circle: library patrons, people Beatrice had interacted with regularly, anyone who might have had unusual interest in her. Several names emerged as persons of interest. There was Dennis Kowalski, a 41-year-old mechanic who'd asked Beatrice out multiple times over the previous year. She'd politely declined each time, and some witnesses reported that Dennis hadn't taken the rejection well. He'd been seen at the bar on Main Street the evening of October 14th, but the timeline was fuzzy. He claimed he'd been there from 7 p.m. until closing at midnight. The bartender remembered him being there, but couldn't pinpoint exactly when he'd arrived. Investigators questioned Dennis extensively. He was defensive, angry at being suspected, but ultimately cooperative. His home and vehicle were searched with his consent. Nothing connected him to Beatrice's disappearance. No physical evidence, no witnesses placing him near the library or the woods. The case against him was purely circumstantial and weak. Then there was Michael Brennan, a drifter who'd been working temporary harvest jobs in the area. Several people reported seeing an unfamiliar man in town during mid-October, someone who didn't belong, who'd been spotted near the library on at least one occasion. Police tracked Brennan to a farm outside of Enid, where he'd moved on to another job. He was questioned, his background checked. He had a minor criminal record, petty theft, trespassing, but nothing violent. And he had witnesses who placed him at a different farm the evening of October 14th, working late to bring in wheat before a forecasted storm. Another dead end. There was also speculation about Robert Keller, a 33-year-old who worked at the grain elevator and lived on the outskirts of town. He was quiet, kept to himself, and had been a regular at the library. Some people mentioned he'd seemed awkward around Beatrice, though no one could point to anything specific. When questioned, Keller said he'd been home alone the evening of October 14th working on his truck. His mother, who lived with him, confirmed he'd been home. Investigators noted his name but had no evidence to pursue him further. The problem was that in a small town everyone knew Beatrice. Dozens of men had interacted with her regularly. Without physical evidence linking anyone to the crime scene, without witnesses, without a body, the investigation kept hitting walls. Detective Walsh and his team conducted over 200 interviews. They administered polygraph tests to several persons of interest, all inconclusive or passed. They searched properties, vehicles, and outbuildings. They followed up on tips that came in from the public, most of which led nowhere. One tip seemed promising. A truck driver reported seeing a woman matching Beatrice's description walking along County Road 47, near where her belongings were later found, around 7 p.m. on October 14th. But he'd been driving past quickly, hadn't stopped, and couldn't provide details beyond a woman in light-colored clothing. When shown a photo of Beatrice, he said, maybe, but couldn't be certain. The woods where her belongings were discovered were searched repeatedly. Cadaver dogs covered every inch of the surrounding area, expanding outward in wider and wider circles. Volunteers continued searching for weeks, then months. Ponds were dragged. Abandoned wells were checked. Every conceivable location where a body might be hidden was examined. Nothing. The harsh reality of 1980s forensic science became painfully clear. Without DNA technology, without digital surveillance, without cell phone records or GPS tracking, investigators were working with one hand tied behind their backs. They had evidence that something violent had happened, but they couldn't definitively prove who was responsible. As October turned to November, then December, the active search efforts began to wind down. The OSBI team returned to Oklahoma City, leaving the case file with Sheriff Bradford and a promise to follow up on any new leads. Detective Walsh told the Rowan family he wouldn't give up, that the case would remain open. But the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. Without a breakthrough, without new evidence, Beatrice's case was going cold. By the first anniversary of her disappearance in October 1987, the investigation had essentially stalled. Tips had dried up. Every lead had been exhausted. The case remained officially open, but active investigation had ceased. Goltry tried to move forward, but the shadow of what happened to Beatrice Rowan lingered over everything. The library felt different. The town felt different. And somewhere, someone who knew exactly what happened that October evening was walking free, living their life, keeping their terrible secret. For now, time doesn't heal all wounds. Sometimes it just teaches you how to live with the pain. For Dorothy and Margaret Rowan, the years after Beatrice's disappearance became an endless cycle of hope and heartbreak. Every phone call could be the one. Every knock on the door might bring news. Every October 14th was a fresh reminder that their daughter and sister was gone, and they still didn't know why. Dorothy kept Beatrice's childhood bedroom exactly as it had been. The floral bedspread, the bookshelf filled with worn paperbacks, the framed photo on the nightstand showing Beatrice at her college graduation, smiling wide in her cap and gown. She couldn't bring herself to change anything. What if Beatrice came home and her room was gone? Deep down, Dorothy knew her daughter wasn't coming home. But hope, even irrational hope, was sometimes all she had to hold on to. Margaret took a different path. She threw herself into advocacy work, becoming a voice for missing persons across Oklahoma. She attended support groups, connected with other families living the same nightmare, and pushed law enforcement to keep cold cases active. She organized annual vigils in Goltry every October 14th, ensuring that Beatrice's name wasn't forgotten. "Someone knows something," Margaret would say at these gatherings, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Someone in this town, or someone who passed through, knows what happened to my sister, and I won't stop asking until we get answers. What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments." The impact on Goltry itself was profound and lasting. The town that had once left doors unlocked now installed deadbolts. Parents who'd let their children roam freely now kept them close, always watching, always worried. The sense of safety that had defined small-town life was shattered. Suspicion poisoned relationships. Neighbors eyed each other differently. Who could be trusted? Who might be hiding something? The investigation had questioned so many people, and while most were cleared, the questions themselves left marks. Dennis Kowalski, the mechanic who'd asked Beatrice out, eventually left town, tired of the whispers and sideways glances. Others stayed but felt the weight of unspoken accusations. The library continued operating, but it was never quite the same. Carol Jensen stayed on as head librarian, doing her best to maintain the programs Beatrice had started. But every time she unlocked those doors in the morning, she thought about that October day when Beatrice's car sat in the parking lot and everything changed. For law enforcement, the case became a source of frustration and regret. Sheriff Bradford retired in 1994, and in his farewell speech, he mentioned Beatrice by name. "My biggest failure," he said, his voice breaking, "was not bringing Beatrice Rowan home to her family. I'm sorry I couldn't give them that." The case file was passed from one sheriff to the next, from one detective to another. Each new investigator would review the evidence, hoping to spot something their predecessors had missed. Each came away with the same conclusion. Without new evidence, without advances in forensic technology, the case was at a standstill. But one investigator refused to let it die completely. Detective Sarah Mendoza joined the Osby Cold Case Unit in 2008, and Beatrice's case immediately caught her attention. She'd grown up hearing about the Goltry librarian who vanished, and now she had the opportunity to do something about it. She kept the file active, reviewing it annually, reaching out to the Rowan family to let them know someone was still fighting for Beatrice. "I made a promise to Margaret," Mendoza later recalled. "I told her that as long as I was working cold cases, Beatrice would never be forgotten. And I meant it." The years rolled on. 1990 became 2000. 2000 became 2010. Dorothy Rowan's health began to decline, the decades of grief taking their toll. She was diagnosed with heart disease in 2015, and doctors said the stress hadn't helped. Margaret visited her mother every week, and they'd sit together looking at old photos of Beatrice, remembering her laugh, her kindness, the way she'd light up talking about books. "I just want to know," Dorothy would say, her voice weak. "Before I die, I just want to know what happened to my baby." Technology was advancing rapidly in the 2010s. DNA databases were expanding. Genetic genealogy was beginning to solve cold cases that had seemed impossible. The Golden State Killer was identified in 2018 using familial DNA and public genealogy databases, sending shockwaves through law enforcement and giving hope to families of cold case victims nationwide. Detective Mendoza watched these developments closely. She knew that evidence from Beatrice's case, specifically the torn cardigan found in the woods, had been preserved. In 1986, they hadn't been able to extract usable DNA from the fabric. But in 2020, that was a different story. She began making calls, consulting with forensic genealogists, exploring possibilities. The technology existed. The question was whether the evidence had been stored properly, whether biological material had survived decades in storage, whether there was enough to build a profile. In 2023, Detective Mendoza got approval to reopen Beatrice's case with a focus on advanced DNA analysis. The evidence was retrieved from storage, carefully preserved items that had sat in a climate-controlled facility for 37 years, waiting for science to catch up. Margaret Rowan got the call in August 2023. Detective Mendoza's voice was cautious, but hopeful. "We're taking another look at your sister's case. New technology. I can't make promises, but I wanted you to know we're trying." Margaret sat down, her hand trembling as she held the phone. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not giving up on her." Neither of them knew it yet, but the breakthrough they'd been waiting for was just months away. The evidence box sat on Detective Sarah Mendoza's desk like a time capsule from another era. Inside were items that had been carefully preserved for 37 years. Beatrice Rowan's torn cream-colored cardigan, sealed in plastic, her broken wristwatch, the library ID badge. Each piece had been photographed, cataloged, and stored according to 1986 protocols, which, fortunately, had been sufficient to maintain the integrity of potential biological evidence. It was January 2024 when the cardigan was sent to Orchid Cellmark, a private forensic laboratory in Texas, specializing in advanced DNA extraction and analysis. The lab had successfully worked on numerous cold cases, extracting viable DNA profiles from evidence decades old. Dr. Patricia Vance, the lead forensic scientist assigned to the case, examined the cardigan under high-powered magnification. The fabric showed significant damage, tears, stains, areas where it had been stretched and pulled. But more importantly, there were areas of interest: the collar, the inner sleeve, places where an attacker might have grabbed the garment, potentially leaving behind skin cells, sweat, or other biological material. "We're looking for touch DNA," Dr. Vance explained to Detective Mendoza during a phone consultation. "When someone grabs fabric forcefully, especially during a struggle, they can transfer epithelial cells, skin cells, onto the material." In 1986, the technology to detect and analyze this kind of trace evidence didn't exist. Today, it's one of our most powerful tools. The extraction process took weeks. Using cutting-edge techniques, the lab isolated several samples from different areas of the cardigan. Not all yielded results. Time and degradation had taken their toll on some samples, but from the right sleeve, near where the fabric had been torn almost completely away, they extracted a viable DNA profile. It was male, and it didn't belong to anyone in Beatrice's family or known associates whose DNA had been collected for elimination purposes. It belonged to her attacker. Detective Mendoza felt her pulse quicken when she received the results in early February. After 38 years, they finally had a genetic fingerprint of the person responsible for Beatrice's disappearance. But having a DNA profile and identifying who it belonged to were two very different challenges. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees. No match. Whoever had attacked Beatrice had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA collection, or had committed the crime before DNA databases existed and had stayed off law enforcement's radar ever since. This was where genetic genealogy entered the picture. Detective Mendoza contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a company at the forefront of forensic genetic genealogy, the same technique that had identified the Golden State Killer and solved dozens of other cold cases. The process was revolutionary. upload the DNA profile to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, identify distant relatives, build family trees, and use genealogical research to narrow down potential suspects. C.C. Moore, one of the leading forensic genealogists in the country, took on Beatrice's case personally. "Every case is like solving a complex puzzle," she explained. "We're not just looking at DNA matches, we're reconstructing entire family histories, sometimes going back generations, to identify who this person could be." The DNA profile was uploaded to GEDmatch in mid-February 2024. Within days, the system identified several distant relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared common ancestors with the unknown suspect, but might not even know those connections existed. What's about to be revealed shocked everyone in this town, and it might shock you too. If you're finding this case as fascinating as I do, go ahead and hit that like button. Cece and her team began the painstaking work of building family trees. They started with the closest DNA matches and worked backward, identifying common ancestors, then working forward through generations, tracking births, marriages, deaths, and migrations. They used census records, obituaries, marriage certificates, military records, any documentation that could help map out family connections. The work was meticulous and time-consuming. Each branch of each family tree had to be thoroughly researched. Dead ends were common. Some branches led to people who'd moved out of state or out of the country. Others led to individuals who died before 1986. But slowly, over the course of 6 weeks, a picture began to emerge. The common ancestors pointed to a family that had deep roots in northern Oklahoma. Multiple branches of the tree led back to the same region, the area around Goltry, Enid, and surrounding communities. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone local or with strong local connections. By late March, the genealogists had narrowed the possibilities down to 3 potential family lines. From there, they identified male relatives who would have been the right age in 1986, between 20 and 50 years old, and who had connections to the Goltry area. One name kept appearing in their research: Robert Allen Keller. Detective Mendoza felt a jolt of recognition when she saw the name. She pulled the original 1986 case file and flipped through the interview logs. There it was. Robert Keller, age 33 at the time, worked at the grain elevator, lived on the outskirts of Goltry. Questioned on October 20th, 1986. Stated he'd been home alone working on his truck the evening of October 14th. His mother corroborated his alibi. No physical evidence connected him to the crime. No follow-up investigation warranted. He'd been on the radar 38 years ago, but without evidence, he'd been just another name in a long list of people who knew Beatrice. Now he was 61 years old, still living in the same house on the outskirts of Goltry. Still quiet, still unremarkable, still apparently hiding in plain sight. But genetic genealogy had placed him in the right family line. The DNA profile from Beatrice's cardigan was consistent with someone from his family tree. To confirm it was specifically Robert Keller, investigators needed a direct DNA sample from him. Detective Mendoza coordinated with local law enforcement to conduct surveillance. They needed to obtain his DNA legally, without alerting him to the investigation. The method they chose was simple but effective: trash pulls. Once garbage is placed on the curb for collection, it's considered abandoned property and can be legally seized by law enforcement. On the morning of April 2nd, 2024, officers collected the trash from Robert Keller's property before the garbage truck arrived. Inside, they found several items that could yield DNA: a disposable coffee cup, used tissues, a discarded razor. These items were sent to the lab for analysis. The weight was excruciating. Detective Mendoza called Margaret Rowan to let her know they had a significant lead, but cautioned her not to get her hopes up until confirmation came through. Margaret, now 68 years old, had heard promises before, but something in Detective Mendoza's voice sounded different this time. "Think this might be it," Mendoza said quietly. "I really think we might have him." On April 15th, 2024, the lab results came back. The DNA from Robert Keller's discarded coffee cup was a direct match to the DNA profile extracted from Beatrice Rowan's torn cardigan. After 38 years, they had their answer. Detective Mendoza sat in her office, staring at the report, feeling the weight of nearly 4 decades of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions finally lifting. She thought about Dorothy Rowan, who had passed away in 2019 without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. She thought about Margaret, who'd spent most of her adult life fighting for this moment. She thought about Beatrice herself, the librarian who'd loved books and children and her small town, whose life had been stolen on an October evening in 1986. And she thought about Robert Keller, who'd lived in Goltry all these years, who'd walked the same streets, shopped at the same stores, attended the same community events, all while carrying the secret of what he'd done. Not anymore. Detective Mendoza picked up her phone and called the district attorney's office. "We have enough for an arrest warrant," she said. "Let's bring him in." The wheels of justice, stalled for 38 years, were finally turning, and Robert Allen Keller's decades of freedom were about to come to an end. March 12, 2024, 6:47 a.m. The arrest team assembled in the pre-dawn darkness at the edge of Goltry, going over the plan one final time. Detective Sarah Mendoza had coordinated with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the local sheriff's department, and the district attorney's office. They had an arrest warrant for Robert Allen Keller on charges of first-degree murder in the death of Beatrice Rowan. Even without a body, the DNA evidence was overwhelming. Combined with the circumstantial evidence from 1986 and the results of the renewed investigation, prosecutors were confident they had a solid case. As the sun began to rise over the Oklahoma plains, 3 unmarked vehicles rolled slowly down Maple Street toward the modest ranch-style house with faded blue shutters where Robert Keller had lived for over 40 years. Neighbors who were awake, Mrs. Patterson making her morning coffee, Mr. Daniels heading out for his early shift at the plant, watched in confusion as officers in tactical vests approached the house. This was Goltry. Things like this didn't happen here, except they did. 38 years ago, something terrible had happened here, and the person responsible had been living among them ever since. Detective Mendoza knocked firmly on the front door. "Robert Keller, this is the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door." There was a long pause, movement inside. Then the door opened slowly. Robert Allen Keller stood in the doorway wearing a faded flannel robe and slippers, his gray hair disheveled from sleep. He was 61 years old now, his face lined and weathered, his frame thinner than it had been in his 30s. He looked like someone's grandfather. Harmless. Ordinary. He looked at the officers, at their weapons, at Detective Mendoza holding up the warrant. And something flickered across his face. Not surprise, but resignation. As if he'd always known this day might come. "Robert Allen Keller, you're under arrest for the murder of Beatrice Rowan," Detective Mendoza said, her voice steady and clear. "You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his Miranda rights, officers moved into the house to secure it. Keller didn't resist. He simply stood there, silent, as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. As he was led to the waiting vehicle, neighbors emerged from their homes, watching in stunned disbelief. Bobby Keller? The quiet guy from the grain elevator? The man who'd lived on this street for decades? What's the weather like where you are today? Rainy? Sunny? Drop it in the comments. By noon, news of the arrest had spread through Goltry like wildfire. The local diner was packed with people trying to process what they'd just learned. The man arrested for Beatrice Rowan's murder wasn't some stranger, some drifter who'd passed through town in 1986. It was someone they knew, someone who'd been here all along. Robert Keller had grown up in Goltry, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher. He'd been a quiet kid, not particularly popular but not an outcast either. After high school, he'd worked various jobs around town before settling into a position at the grain elevator in his mid-20s. He'd never married, never had children. He'd lived with his mother until she passed away in 2003, then continued living alone in the family home. People who knew him described him as unremarkable, polite but distant. He'd show up for work, do his job, go home. He attended church occasionally but wasn't particularly involved. He'd help neighbors with odd jobs if asked, but never sought out social interaction. He was just there, one longtime resident said. You'd see him at the hardware store getting gas and he'd nod hello, but that was about it. I never would have thought. But Detective Mendoza's investigation had uncovered details that painted a more disturbing picture. Robert Keller had been a regular at the Goltry Public Library in 1986. Multiple witnesses from the original investigation confirmed he'd come in frequently, always when Beatrice was working. He'd check out books, mostly westerns and history, but several people remembered that he'd often just sit at one of the tables, reading, watching. One former library volunteer, interviewed again in 2024, recalled something she hadn't thought significant at the time. He'd always position himself where he could see Beatrice. I remember thinking it was a little odd, but I figured maybe he just liked watching her work. She was good at her job, very organized. I didn't think it was predatory. In the original 1986 investigation, Keller had been questioned because he was known to frequent the library. He'd told investigators he'd been home alone the evening of October 14th, working on his truck. His mother, who'd been inside the house, said she'd heard him in the garage and assumed he'd been there all evening. She hadn't actually seen him, but she'd had no reason to doubt him. It was a weak alibi, but without evidence connecting him to the crime, investigators had moved on to other leads. Now, with DNA evidence placing him at the scene, his genetic material on Beatrice's torn cardigan, the timeline could be reconstructed with chilling clarity. Based on the evidence and witness statements, investigators believed the following had occurred. Robert Keller had been obsessed with Beatrice Rowan. He'd watched her, studied her routines, knew when she closed the library, and that she was often the last person to leave. On the evening of October 14th, 1986, he'd waited in the parking lot, possibly parked in a location where his vehicle wouldn't be immediately visible. When Beatrice locked up and walked to her car around 6:30 p.m., he'd approached her. What he said, what pretext he used, may never be fully known. But at some point the interaction turned violent. Perhaps she rejected an advance. Perhaps she tried to get away. Perhaps she screamed. He'd forced her into his vehicle, likely his truck, which he'd claimed to be working on that evening. He'd driven her to the wooded area 3 miles outside town, a location he would have known well, having grown up in the area. What happened in those woods was something investigators could only piece together from the evidence. The struggle, the torn clothing, Beatrice fighting for her life. And then at some point, her life had ended. Keller had scattered some of her belongings to make it look like she'd fled through the woods, perhaps hoping to suggest she'd run away or been taken by someone else. Then he'd returned to town, parked her car back at the library to deepen the mystery, and gone home. He'd walked into his house, probably told his mother he was done working on the truck, and gone to bed. And the next morning, when news spread that Beatrice was missing, he'd expressed the same shock and concern as everyone else. For 38 years, he'd carried that secret. He'd watched the searches, the vigils, the anniversary remembrances. He'd seen Dorothy Rowan's grief, Margaret's determination, the community's pain, and he'd said nothing. He'd gone to work every day at the grain elevator. He'd lived his quiet, unremarkable life. He'd attended the funeral service held for Beatrice in 1990, even though no body had been found. He'd stood in the back of the church, just another mourner, just another concerned community member, all while knowing exactly what he'd done. The question that haunted everyone in Goltry wasn't just how he'd done it. It was how he'd lived with himself afterward, how he'd looked people in the eye, knowing what he'd taken from them. But Robert Keller wasn't talking. Not yet. The interrogation room at the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation field office in Enid was small, windowless, and deliberately uncomfortable. A metal table, 3 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner, recording everything. Robert Keller sat on one side of the table, still wearing the clothes he'd been arrested in, jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that officers had allowed him to change into before transport. His hands were folded in front of him, his expression blank. Detective Sarah Mendoza sat across from him, a thick folder containing 38 years of investigation in front of her. Next to her was Agent Tom Richardson from the OSBI, a veteran interrogator with decades of experience. "Robert, you know why you're here," Mendoza began, her voice calm but firm. "We have DNA evidence that places you at the scene. Your DNA was found on Beatrice Rowan's cardigan, the one she was wearing the night she disappeared, the one that was torn off her body in those woods. We know you were there. We know what you did." Keller stared at the table, silent. "This is your opportunity to tell your side of the story," Agent Richardson added. "To explain what happened. Was it an accident? Did something go wrong? Did she say something that set you off?" Still nothing. Keller's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look up. "Her family deserves answers, Robert," Mendoza continued. "Her mother died without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. Her sister has spent nearly 40 years wondering. You can give them that closure. You can tell us where Beatrice is." For the first time, Keller's eyes flickered up to meet Mendoza's. There was something in his gaze. Not remorse, but calculation. He was weighing his options, considering what to say, what to admit, what to deny. Then he spoke, his voice quiet and rough from disuse. "I want a lawyer." And that was it. The interrogation was over before it really began. Keller was formally booked into the Garfield County Jail on charges of first-degree murder. His bond was set at $2 million, an amount he had no possibility of posting. He would remain in custody pending trial. The news of his arrest made headlines across Oklahoma and beyond. Cold case solved after 38 years. DNA evidence leads to arrest in 1986 disappearance. National crime shows picked up the story. Dateline, 48 Hours, and several true crime podcasts reached out to cover the case. Margaret Rowan held a press conference 3 days after the arrest, standing outside the Goltry Public Library where her sister had worked and loved. "For 38 years our family has lived with a hole that could never be filled," she said, her voice strong despite the tears streaming down her face. "My mother died without answers. My father died without answers. But today we finally know the truth. We know who took Beatrice from us. And while nothing can bring her back, knowing that justice is finally being served brings a measure of peace we haven't felt in decades." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "To anyone else out there living with an unsolved case, living with that same pain and uncertainty, don't give up. Technology is advancing. Investigators are still fighting. Your answers may be closer than you think." The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. Keller's court-appointed attorney, a public defender named James Hartley, faced an uphill battle. The DNA evidence was ironclad. The statistical probability that the DNA on Beatrice's cardigan belonged to anyone other than Robert Keller was approximately 1 in 47 trillion. But Hartley did what defense attorneys do. He looked for weaknesses in the prosecution's case. The lack of a body was a significant challenge for prosecutors. Without remains, without a definitive cause of death, the defense could argue that Beatrice might still be alive somewhere, that the DNA could have been transferred innocently, that the evidence was circumstantial. It was a weak argument, and everyone knew it. But it was all they had. District Attorney Patricia Gomez was confident. "We've successfully prosecuted murder cases without a body before," she told reporters. "The DNA evidence, combined with the circumstances of the disappearance, the location where her torn clothing was found, and the defendant's connection to the victim, paint a clear picture of what happened. Robert Keller murdered Beatrice Rowan in October 1986, and we will prove that beyond a reasonable doubt." As the case moved through preliminary hearings, additional evidence came to light. Investigators executed a search warrant on Keller's property and found items that, while not directly connected to Beatrice, suggested a disturbing pattern. In a locked box in his bedroom closet, They discovered newspaper clippings about Beatrice's disappearance, carefully preserved for decades, articles from 1986, 1987, anniversary pieces from later years. He'd kept them all, a macabre collection documenting the crime he'd committed and the investigation that had failed to catch him. There were also photographs, not of Beatrice specifically, but of the library, taken from various angles, some clearly shot from inside his vehicle in the parking lot. The dates on the photo development envelopes ranged from 1985 to early 1986, suggesting he'd been surveilling her for months before the attack. The prosecution added these items to their evidence list. They painted a picture of obsession, of premeditation, of a man who'd targeted Beatrice deliberately and violently. Keller's attorney tried to suppress some of the evidence, arguing it was prejudicial. The judge denied most of the motions. The trial was scheduled for September 2024. As summer approached, Goltry remained in a state of shock and processing. The arrest had answered the question that had haunted them for decades, but it had also forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like your neighbor. Sometimes it lives on your street for 40 years, quiet and unremarkable, hiding in plain sight. And sometimes, justice takes nearly 4 decades to arrive. But it arrives nonetheless. Beatrice Rowan was 32 years old when her life was stolen from her on an October evening in 1986. She was a daughter who called her mother every Sunday, a sister who never missed a birthday, a librarian who knew every child's favorite book and made sure they had access to stories that would spark their imagination. She was a person who mattered, whose absence left a wound in her community that never fully healed. For 38 years, her family lived with questions that had no answers. Her mother died without knowing what happened to her daughter. Her father passed away still wondering if Beatrice had suffered, if she'd been afraid, if she'd known in those final moments that people loved her. But Margaret never stopped fighting. She never stopped asking questions, demanding answers, keeping her sister's name alive. And because of that persistence, because of advances in forensic science, because of investigators like Detective Sarah Mendoza who refused to let cold cases stay cold, justice finally came. The arrest of Robert Keller sent shockwaves through Goltry, but it also brought something the town hadn't felt in decades: closure. The mystery that had haunted them, the fear that had changed how they lived their lives, finally had an answer. It wasn't the answer anyone wanted. Knowing that the person responsible had lived among them all those years was deeply disturbing, but it was an answer nonetheless. The case also highlighted the incredible power of modern forensic technology. DNA evidence that couldn't be processed in 1986 became the key to solving the case in 2024. Genetic genealogy, a tool that didn't exist when Beatrice disappeared, identified her killer when traditional investigation methods had failed. Across the United States, there are thousands of cold cases waiting for this same breakthrough. Families waiting for answers. Victims whose stories haven't ended yet. And thanks to advancing technology and dedicated investigators, many of those cases are being reopened, re-examined, and solved. The Beatrice Rowan case proves that time doesn't erase evidence. It doesn't erase guilt. And it doesn't erase the determination of people who refuse to give up on justice. As of now, Robert Keller remains in custody, awaiting trial. His attorney has indicated he may consider a plea deal, though prosecutors have stated they're prepared to take the case to trial if necessary. The question of where Beatrice's remains are located remains unanswered. Keller has not cooperated with investigators, and searches of properties connected to him have not yielded results. But Margaret Rowan has said that even without recovering her sister's body, knowing the truth about what happened brings a peace she didn't think was possible. For so long we lived in this terrible limbo, she said in a recent interview. Not knowing was its own kind of torture. Now we know. We know who took her from us. We know she didn't leave voluntarily, didn't abandon us. We know she fought, and we know that the person responsible will finally face consequences for what he did. That matters. It matters so much. If this story moved you or taught you something about the power of never giving up on justice, please share this video. And let me know in the comments, what other cold cases would you like me to cover? Don't forget to subscribe to Revealed Crime Cases for more deep dives into true crime stories that matter. Beatrice Rowan's story didn't end the way anyone hoped it would. But after 38 years of silence, her voice was finally heard. And justice, though delayed, finally came.